start by telling you what Relink is. Relink is an online database in the state of Ohio, and it's free to use, free to be listed on. And our database is anonymous, so anybody who goes on Relink, we're not tracking what you're looking at, we're not tracking any IP addresses. It's totally anonymous to use. We have over 18,000 resources listed in all 88 counties. And we are on the tablets in all the prisons, as well as we have the general version. So we have about 2,000 people who are incarcerated that use Relink each week, and about 3,000 people who use the general version each week. So we just try to make it really accessible for anyone who's in need and looking for resources to easily be able to find them. So if you go to relink.org, you'll have this option to click on Find Help Now. And you'll see these different categories that you can choose from. We have addiction recovery, we have reentry, human trafficking, family services. So that would be like if somebody is getting a new job and they're looking for affordable childcare or somewhere that would take a voucher, things that would help support a family. Emergency and crisis numbers, basic needs, behavioral health. We've tried to put in all of the mental health providers in the state of Ohio, whether it be individual counseling, family counseling, art therapy, music therapy, all different types of therapies. And then we also have a Get Involved tab as well down at the bottom. So when you select whatever city or zip code that you want to be looking at, or by county. You can choose a mile range anywhere up to 250 miles. And when you click on human trafficking, which was one of those green buttons on the page prior, these are some of the different categories that will come up: human trafficking hotlines, food pantries, hot meals, safe houses and shelter, and clothing. So as you click into those, you'll get more information for each of those providers, all of their information from their address, their hours of operation, anything that you need to connect with them will be listed when you click on those. One other category that is really popular in Relink is probably our most looked at category is basic needs. So I just wanted to highlight some of the basic need categories. We have food, which would be those hot meals and food pantries. Housing, we have all different housing listed in Relink: affordable housing, housing for those reentering back from incarceration, housing, safe housing for somebody who is a victim of human trafficking. We have free clothing, free furniture, healthcare listed, community support, financial assistance, and transportation assistance. I did just want to remind you that if you are working with anyone who is Spanish speaking, that's their primary first language, you can turn the entire database into Spanish quickly. It doesn't take a long time to upload, which is what I first thought it would take a while, but it instantaneously can convert between Spanish and English. So you would just click the little flag that's up in the top right on each page. If you are not on Relink and you're a provider, we'd love to add you in. We want to make sure we have everybody in the state of Ohio listed. So you can easily go to our homepage again, and then there will be a provider login up in the top right. When you click on that, you can make your provider login, and that would be your first name, last name, your email address, and a password. So we don't do anything with those email addresses. People ask us if we sell them or we make lists. We don't do that. We're only connecting you to your page so that you have access to then edit your organization data, which that's what this page is showing. Once you have that login, then you can go in and you can update your page any time of the day, 24/7. So if you have something last minute, like yesterday would have been a perfect example. There was probably many food pantries or shelters or places that had edited hours because of the snowstorm. So you could easily go in and change that so that people know that your organization was closed for the day because of the snow, and then go back, and it takes 2 seconds to put in the correct information again today that you're back open and your hours of operation are the same again. You will get one social work CEU for participating today. If you need one, a survey should pop up at the end. Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. But don't worry, if it doesn't pop up on your screen, it's set to pop up. I am sending a follow-up email tomorrow, and it'll have any information that Kirsty from Eyes Up Appalachia, and the speakers want in that follow-up email, as well as this link again for the survey that you can fill out and the recording of today. So if you want to share it with anyone or feel like this is information someone else could benefit from in your organization, you can share that link of the recording. If you have to get off after an hour, sometimes it goes a little longer. If we have extra questions, it's not a problem. You still get your CEU for being on an hour. You don't have to be on the full time if we run over a little bit. So our second part in this series is going to be from insight to impact, how we reduce demand together. And that one is going to be Tuesday, February 17th at 2 o'clock. We already have the link set up for that webinar and we are sending it out. We have several people already signed up, so that's great. You might have already signed up for that as well, but it will come out if you're on our newsletter mailing. We send out those emails each week with our webinar information. If you sign up to have a login with Relink, we don't add you to our email newsletter. So if you want to be added, you can write us at info@relink.org. Or if you want that link to register, you can write me there as well as I can send it. Kirsty's going to be our host today. We are just appreciate our working relationship with her and all the great work that she does, how we can partner together and do this work in this space. And this is her web address, www.eyesupappalachia.org, if you'd like to go on there and see some more information about the great work she's doing and the resources that she has. Also for Stu and Jen, this is their web address, www.solicitoreducation.com. And I'm sure they'll be talking a little bit more about that and how you can get in touch with them. And the last slide is our information at Relink. So if you need anything, you can always call us. Kathleen answers the phone. We're happy to answer questions about your data. If you ever need any, we have table cards with Relink on it that you'd like to pass out. You can ask us for those. We've worked with Christy on a little trifold that you give to any youth that are at risk, and that's been really popular. This is the second time we've got to print it together. So you can ask us for some of those, and she might talk about that briefly for a minute when she's speaking. But you can always call us or email us at info@relink.org, and we'll be happy to help and get that information to you. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Christy. Thank you for hosting today.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. Hello, everybody. So happy to have you here. I see lots of friends, lots of names that I recognize on the attendees. So I'm very happy to have you here. I'm going to do a lot of you do know me, Christy Bartman, Eyes Up Appalachia. I do anti-human trafficking education and training throughout primarily the Appalachian counties of Ohio. However, I do a good bit of training on familial trafficking throughout the state. And so I've enjoyed working with a lot of you that are on the call today, and look forward to working with many of you. But let's not go into anything else. I want to bring the speakers on because this is going to be a really great session and the beginning of a year-long focus on men and boys. So looking forward to that as we go. But let me introduce Stu. C. Stewart Kitchen is a researcher, educator, and program director specializing in offender intervention, criminal diversion, and incarcerated learner development. Since January 2020, he has facilitated at the Columbus Solicitor Education Program, a court-mandated diversion initiative addressing the beliefs and behaviors that lead to sex buying. He is now the director of programming of a new entity, Solicitor Education Programs, LLC, which administers evidence-based, court-ordered diversion curricula for individuals who have been arrested for sexual solicitation. Stu's work bridges research and practice, advancing innovative strategies to reduce recidivism, change offender behavior, and expand educational opportunities within justice systems. We also have Jen with us today. Jen, is it Paella? Tell me, pronounce your last name for me.
Piella.
Piella, there we go. Okay, so Jen Piella is with us today. She's a people programs and wellness leader with over 20 years of experience supporting education, connection, and leadership initiatives in healthcare and corporate settings. She is the founder and facilitator of the Solicitor Family Support Group, created to offer education and compassionate support for family members impacted by sexual solicitation behaviors. Jen brings a thoughtful, systems-informed, and trauma-aware lens to conversations about why people solicit, the ripple effects on families, and the role of education, accountability, and support in reducing secrecy and finding healing. So please, I'm looking forward to what you both have to say. I will monitor the chat and let's get started.
All right, Christy, thank you so much. Rachel, I appreciate everything that you've done to help put this together today. We're really excited to be sharing the information that we've gathered over recent years on individuals who have been arrested for buying sex around Central Ohio and also countrywide. I think a lot of the data that we have found in recent years has helped us create programming that doesn't just hold men accountable, but really helps them look at their past, the the things that they've learned throughout their lives and been exposed to that have shaped their beliefs when it comes to sex, power, relationships, and maybe lead to some of the coping behaviors related to buying sex and other unhealthy behaviors just in general. So before we get started, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about She Has a Name, which is an anti-human trafficking nonprofit in Columbus. She Has a Name is who has administered the Columbus Solicitor Education Program for many years now. And as we have continued to evolve and grow that curriculum, we have separated into a separate entity that is still underneath the umbrella of She Has a Name. And it has allowed us to, one, kind of just prevent some brand contamination in who we're trying to reach out to and who our primary clientele are on both ends, where She Has a Name provides human trafficking survivor support, solicitor education programs, provides accountability programming for men who have been arrested for buying sex. So the separation has allowed us to really focus our branding and our marketing towards those two different entities, but we are still one and the same. All men who are arrested for buying sex in Central Ohio have to take this court-ordered diversion program. It costs $350, and all of those funds go directly to She Has a Name survivor care initiatives, mostly to scholarships for survivors of human trafficking. So we work hand in hand to fight human trafficking, really from two different angles. She Has a Name's mission is that they are a strong community that exists to fight human trafficking through education and care for all those impacted. And early on, when they came up with that mission and they talked about all those impacted, it really resonated with the survivor community and wanting to take care of survivors. And I think when we think of human trafficking and how we combat human trafficking, I think of it as kind of a wheel where we have this center spoke that is survivor care. But there's all of these other spokes that come into it, and this big circle around it, the outside of that wheel, is what we call demand reduction. And if we look at human trafficking, we've always addressed it as a crime that we thought that we could arrest ourselves out of. The reality is it's a business. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but the way you bring down any business is to reduce the demand for the product that that business sells. And right now, who is driving the demand for human trafficking is largely men. There are some women who choose to purchase sex, but it's largely men who are purchasing sex and creating the demand for that product. We see these as those men who are buying sex as individuals who are also impacted by human trafficking. And while She Has a Name may use the word care, I tend to use the word accountability. And I think Jen would probably agree that what we do in Columbus is we bring these men in and we start a process of accountability for them to learn from their actions and learn how what they do impacts themselves, the individuals they are purchasing sex from, their families, and their communities. This is our 2024-2025 impact report from She Has a Name. Um, and on the education side, we had 679 individuals go through all of our programming through She Has a Name. We offer Human Trafficking 101 that's available for CEU credit. Some of that education you will get here today. We had 175 online learners. We have an e-course available that is a Human Trafficking 101 class. And we offered 24 training sessions, both for corporate entities, training sessions like this, going to conferences, educating people about human trafficking and what human trafficking really looks like in our communities. Unfortunately, we have movies like Taken or The Sound of Freedom that have given us this image of human trafficking that doesn't really depict what human trafficking typically looks like in Ohio, in many states, actually. And I know Christy does a lot of education on what familial trafficking looks like. And that's a majority of what trafficking is in Ohio, and it doesn't look like what we see in the movies. So, what we really try to do is give people a true understanding of what human trafficking is and what it looks like so we can better combat that action in our local communities. For the solicitor education program, we had 143 individuals go through the solicitor education program last year, which led to $18,200 invested into our survivor scholarship programs. And we provide survivor care. 11 scholarships for higher education totaling $15,600. And then we offered 3 dream scholarships. And what She Has a Name's dream scholarships are is we let the survivors talk about what they've always wanted to do, bucket list items that they've wanted to accomplish. We have sent survivors on their dream vacation. We have helped them start a business, helped them publish a book. We're really proud of that. It's something kind of unique in the survivor space that we can see our investment really making lives better.
All right. So as we get started here and talking a little bit deeper about this content, we want to start with some foundational information and just kind of get on the same page. Much of this may be understanding that you as a group know well here, but I think it's always good to start with this foundation. So Stu, go ahead and move to the next page as we talk about the business of human trafficking. So, to begin, at its most basic level, human trafficking is the exploitation of a vulnerability or an opportunity. So, that vulnerability could be economic, emotional, social, or situational, but trafficking always begins with someone identifying a weakness and then choosing to take advantage of it. So, to better understand how trafficking is legally defined, we use what's called the AMP model: action, means, and purpose. This model comes from the United Nations definition of human trafficking and helps us break a complex crime into clear components. So, the action refers to what is done, things like recruiting, transporting, harboring, or obtaining a person. The means describes how that action is carried out. This is where we see force, fraud, or coercion. And finally, the purpose is exploitation, whether that's forced labor, sexual exploitation, or other forms of abuse. Now, in a court of law, prosecutors must prove elements from each of these categories to establish that trafficking occurred. This is what distinguishes trafficking from other crimes like abuse, assault, or fraud alone. When we talk about force, fraud, and coercion, it really is important to understand that force isn't always physical. While physical violence is and does occur, trafficking often relies more heavily on psychological coercion. So threats, manipulation, isolation, debt, or control over basic needs like housing or immigration status. This is where vulnerabilities play a critical role. Factors such as poverty, immigration status, prior abuse, unstable housing, or lack of a support system, they don't cause trafficking, but they definitely increase the risk. Traffickers exploit these vulnerabilities deliberately, positioning themselves as helpers or employers or even protectors before exerting control. Understanding trafficking through this lens helps us recognize that it's not always obvious and that it often looks very different from common stereotypes. So Stu, if you want to move to the next page. As we look at human trafficking as an international business, so when we zoom out from these individual cases, it's important to understand that human trafficking is not just a social issue. It generates an estimated $236 billion in illegal profits each year, making it one of the most profitable criminal industries in the world, alongside drug and arms trafficking. That profit is built on exploitation. In 2023, an estimated 49.6 million people worldwide were living in situations of human trafficking or forced labor. And it's important to note that these numbers are estimates because trafficking is a hidden crime. Many victims are unable to self-identify or are afraid to come forward or simply don't recognize their situation as trafficking. Of those in forced labor, about 12% are children. More than half of those children are exploited through commercial sexual exploitation, which highlights how deeply trafficking intersects with child abuse and sexual violence. When we look specifically at forced labor, approximately 27.6 million people are trapped in these conditions globally. Of those, around 6.3 million people are subjected to forced commercial sexual exploitation. And women and girls are disproportionately affected, especially in the commercial sex industry, where they account for the vast majority, about 99% of identified victims. Financially, forced labor in the private economy accounts for the full $236 billion in annual profits, and nearly $99 billion of that comes directly from commercial sexual exploitation alone. These numbers reinforce a really critical point that trafficking persists because it's profitable. And like any business, like Stu said, it relies on demand, vulnerable populations, and systems that allow exploitation to go unseen or unchallenged. Go ahead and move to the next slide. So this slide brings the issue a little bit closer to home. The data that you're seeing here comes from the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which maintains one of the most comprehensive data sets on human trafficking in the United States. It's important to understand what this data represents. So these numbers are not based on confirmed prosecutions. They're based on signals received by the hotline. So this includes phone calls, emails, or online tip reports. Each signal could represent a victim, or it could be a concerned community member, a service provider, or law enforcement reaching out for help or guidance. The hotline uses this information both to connect victims and survivors to services and to help anti-trafficking field better understand patterns and trends. What this shows is the number of reported cases by state, not the true prevalence of trafficking, though. So higher numbers don't necessarily mean trafficking is more common in these states. Often it reflects a greater awareness, population size, access to resources, or just simply a willingness to report. In Ohio, the hotline recorded 310 cases in a single year. So this was 2020 data, placing Ohio in the top 10 nationwide. That ranking, now it often surprises people, but it highlights that trafficking is not just a border issue or big city issue. It's happening in our communities. Now, another note to make to put this in perspective, a 2016 U.S. Department of Justice funded study estimated that between 9,000 and 10,000 juveniles were involved in the sex trade in the United States at this time. And even that number is widely understood to be underestimated. Trafficking is vastly underreported due to fear, shame, lack of trust in systems, immigration concerns, and the fact that many victims, especially minors, do not identify themselves as victims. So when we look at these statistics, it's critical to remember that this is only the tip of the iceberg. For every reported case here, there are many more that remain hidden. The data helps us see patterns, but the true scope of trafficking is so much larger than what any chart can capture here. I'm going to move to the next slide. So we'll bring it back a little bit more when we say it's a local business. On this map, you see Ohio. And when we say that it's a local business, we mean that it adapts to the communities and economies around it. It doesn't only exist somewhere else, it shows up where there is opportunity. So if you look at the heat map, it reflects calls to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So a few clear patterns begin to emerge. So we can see some higher concentrations of reports around major cities. So the 3 Cs, Cincinnati, Columbus, and Cleveland are represented. We also see some higher populations or calls coming in from along interstate highways or at key transportation corridors. These areas provide traffickers with access and a steady flow of people. We also see reports coming from some rural areas, which is important to name and call out. In some of these communities, there may be fewer law enforcement resources, less access to services, and greater isolation, all of which can increase vulnerability and make exploitation easier to hide. In Ohio specifically, trafficking takes many different forms depending on the landscape. So in rural areas, we may see familial trafficking or labor exploitation tied to agricultural or seasonal work. In urban centers, trafficking may appear as street-based or venue-based commercial sexual exploitation. The form changes, but the underlying dynamics remain the same. Highways and a diverse population create opportunity, not because they cause trafficking, but because traffickers exploit movement, labor demands, and gaps in oversight. Now, as mentioned on the previous slide, it's also important to restate that Ohio's high ranking doesn't necessarily mean trafficking is more prevalent here than elsewhere. We hope, and the evidence suggests, that it reflects greater awareness, stronger community engagement, and more service providers and residents recognizing and reporting these concerning situations that they observe. When we view trafficking through an economic lens, it becomes clear that exploitation follows supply and demand, access, and vulnerability. Understanding that shifts our focus from isolated incidents to systems and prevention. We can move to the next slide.
All right, thank you, Jen. So before we can talk about how we address demand, I think it's important for us to understand who exactly is buying sex in the first place. So we have a lot of data out there, national studies, local studies, and we see that a lot of the local data and the national data is pretty similar. This data here is from a 2014 Demanding Justice report that reviewed 407 cases. So we're going to look at some national data really quick on who is buying sex, and we'll look at some local data that we have collected in Ohio. So, nationally, the average age that individuals who've been arrested for purchasing sex admit that they have purchased sex is 43 years old. 19% of the buyers' professions involved working with children, which includes teachers. 22% involved a position of authority or trust, including law enforcement agents. And I'll tell you, having been teaching sex buyer education programs for almost 5 years now, or over 5 years now, I will tell you every time that I walk into my class, I am blown away by the cross section of America that I see. Every socioeconomic class, every race, religion, color is represented in the room that I'm in. Sex buying is not a white collar crime. It is not an inner city crime. It is a crime that is used equally regardless of what sector of society that you may associate yourself with. So in a national study, they interviewed men on 5 different reasons that they believe that they have solicited sex. This is sex with intimacy, sex without intimacy, just getting variety, thrills, and lastly, pathology. But we did our own study because we felt that that was a little too broad. And getting into those very broad sectors of data didn't really help us understand why men are buying sex. So since 2007, Columbus has had a sex buyer intervention program, started out as what we call the John School and has evolved to what we have today as the Solicitor Education Program. Now, the old model of John schools had what we would call a shaming approach, where we would bring men in and shame them, just talk about the impact that they had on other people and how horrible the behavior is. But until very recently, we really didn't start addressing the underlying belief systems that lead to the behavior. And this data here helped start the process of change for us. So in 2007, they started interviewing men on why they chose to purchase sex. So since then, over 1,000 individuals have graduated from the Columbus Solicitor Education Program. Over 700 individuals have filled out surveys. This is actually a little bit outdated. We actually have over 900 individuals that have filled out surveys now. The average age is 45 that they say that they first solicited sex, or that are graduates of the program, excuse me. That's very similar to the national data. 35 is the average age that they say that they first solicited, and there are 23 questions in each of these surveys. And what we didn't realize that we were building is the most comprehensive data set on sex buyers available in the country. So 5 years ago, we started analyzing all of this data, and we came to some pretty interesting conclusions, and we'll get into some of that data here in just a moment. So first of all, let's talk about ethnicity. Caucasian, 42%, African Americans, 36%, Hispanics, 11%, Asian, 8%, and other, 3%. And this is just individuals who've been arrested for buying sex in Central Ohio. And what's interesting about this pie graph is it's a pretty accurate cross-section of inner city Columbus or Central Ohio as a whole. Anybody within that 270 area there. And it pretty much accurately depicts the breakdown of most areas of Columbus also. We asked marital status, and this is when things really started getting interesting for us. 45% of the men claim to be single, 38% claim to be married, 12% divorced, 4% separated, and 1% claimed to be other. So then we asked them, are you currently in a committed relationship? 51% said yes, and 49% said no. Um, or 49 yes, 51% no, excuse me. And that was kind of shocking for us. We weren't expecting men who were largely married to be engaging in this type of behavior. So that led to us asking a next question. If yes, are you emotionally satisfied in that relationship? And if yes, are you sexually satisfied in that relationship? 78% of men claim to be emotionally satisfied in their relationship, and 66% of men claim to be sexually satisfied in their relationship. And this really led to a lot of confusion on our end because we thought, well, we have all these men who are claiming to be largely in committed relationships, who are largely admitting to be both emotionally and sexually satisfied in their relationships. So why are they choosing to engage in this kind of behavior? There has to be something a little bit deeper than just deciding to um, do this on a whim. So let's talk about some of the reasons.
Yeah. So the next two slides will list the 9 specific reasons people solicit in order of the most common responses. So go ahead and move to the next slide. So this question asked respondents to identify which factors influence their decision to buy sex. Participants were able to select all options that applied. So the percentages reflect overlapping motivations rather than a single primary reason. The most commonly cited factor by a significant margin was that engaging with sex workers offers sex without responsibilities of a relationship, selected by 26% of our respondents, or 255 individuals. Now, the second most common reason was easy access, with 16% indicating that engaging with sex workers was simply a convenient way to obtain sex. Closely followed, that 15% described the experience is exciting or thrilling, suggesting that novelty and risk also play a role. Several responses point to issues of self-perception and relationship dissatisfaction. 9% reported feeling unattractive to women. 8% indicated their current relationship was unsatisfying. Another 7% said they had difficulty meeting women. And together, these responses suggest that for some individuals, purchasing sex is connected with feelings of rejection, inadequacy, or even relational barriers. Other motivations include a desire for a variety of partners, which was 8%, the ability to engage in sexual activities that they believe a traditional partner would not be willing to engage in, so that was 7%. And then finally, a smaller subset, 3% of our respondents, indicated that they actually prefer engaging with sex workers to a traditional relationship, which is important to note, but represents a minority view within the sample. Now, overall, these findings show that the decision to buy sex is multifactorial. It's driven not only by sexual desire, but also by emotional avoidance, accessibility, self-image, and relationship dynamics. If we go ahead and move to the next slide. This next slide reflects responses to an open-ended questions where participants were asked in their own words why they first sought to engage in activities with a sex worker. So because these were handwritten narrative responses, the research team was able to reliably categorize 351 out of the 705 total responses into 9 thematic categories. What's important to note here is that these themes emerged organically from the respondents themselves rather than being selected from a predefined list. So the most frequently identified theme was loneliness, and that accounted for 20% of categorized responses, or 69 individuals. This was followed by lack of sex, intimacy, or companionship. That was 17%, which was highlighting unmet relational and emotional needs rather than purely sexual motivation. Several responses reflected novelty seeking or emotional stimulation, so curiosity, 13%, boredom at 13%, a desire for something new or different at 9%, fun at 8%, excitement 7%, and thrill at 5%. Now, notably, depression appeared in 8% of the responses, pointing to underlying mental health struggles for a meaningful subset of the respondents. Taken together, these findings underscore that the reasons men solicit are complex and varied. They extend far beyond common stereotypes such as pornography use or sex addiction. For many of these men, the data points to deeper issues related to loneliness, emotional disconnection, depression, or even unmet intimacy needs. It is critical to be clear these reasons do not excuse or justify the criminal behavior. However, understanding the underlying motivations can help us more effectively identify what may actually reduce future harm. For example, I met one man in his 70s who had just celebrated his 50th wedding anniversary and decided to solicit because he couldn't remember the last time his wife had sex with him, let alone remembered his name. She had been recently diagnosed with Alzheimer's and dementia. So this context does not excuse his actions, but it does suggest that his needs may be better addressed through grief support and relational counseling rather than defaulting to interventions like sex addiction treatment. Understanding what's happening beneath the surface allows us to move beyond the one size fits all responses and toward more effective targeted solutions that prioritize accountability while also addressing the root causes. Next slide.
Thank you, Jen. I'd like to add a little perspective on this as well. Um, we talk a lot in society about the men's mental health epidemic, and we talk about why men sometimes struggle with suicidal ideation or following through with suicide, perhaps maybe more than their female counterparts do. And if we look at the data on when men have been surveyed about, why they feel like they have these issues with their own mental health, loneliness, lack of companionship, depression, those are all some of the top things listed there as well. Again, this is not ever the idea for us to make an excuse for these men, but understanding that some of the same issues that the men who are choosing sex buying as a coping mechanism um, is very similar to the same things that men who are experiencing other issues is going through, gives us a little bit of insight on um, exactly what's going on here. For some instances, is sex buying or is sexual deviation a coping mechanism for some more underlying issues? And do those need to be addressed? And Jen shared earlier that we had an elderly gentleman in one of our programs a few years ago who couldn't remember the last time his wife remembered his name. In that same class, we had an 18-year-old who told us that the first time he ever had sex was when he was 16 because his older brother bought him sex when he was in Las Vegas. The type of education and intervention that 16, 18, 19, 20-year-old needs compared to a senior citizen who may be struggling with other things is very different. And we used to have a very cookie cutter model of sex buyer diversion in Columbus. And what we have built is a model that really addresses the underlying issues. And we'll get into that a little bit more here. So let's talk about what the research says. Some of this is going to be national research. Some of this is going to be local research that we conducted here in Columbus. So, childhood trauma and commercial sex. So when we look at the data on sex buyers and individuals involved in the commercial sex market, one of the clearest patterns we see is the role of early childhood trauma. Research shows that as a person's adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, accumulate, their likelihood of either buying or selling sex increases. In other words, we're not just looking at isolated events, but the cumulative weight of trauma shaping adult behaviors and vulnerabilities. One of the particularly striking findings from the Diamond, Welch, and Kozlowski study is the specific impact of childhood sexual abuse. For individuals who go on to buy sex, sexual abuse in childhood stands out as the strongest predictor. This gives us important insight. Many buyers are not simply making bad choices in a vacuum. They may be attempting to reenact, regain control over, or dissociate from unresolved trauma. When we shift to the data on individuals who end up selling sex, the story becomes even more complex. Again, childhood sexual abuse increases the likelihood, but so does growing up in a household with physical violence. In contrast, household emotional or physiological or psychological abuse appears to decrease participation in selling sex, which may reflect different coping mechanisms or different pathways of trauma expression. The big takeaway here is that both buying and selling are often rooted in trauma histories, though the pathways often diverge. Understanding these trauma profiles helps us shape interventions differently. For buyers, we focus on breaking harmful behavioral cycles linked to early abuse. For individuals selling sex, the priority often becomes safety, stabilization, and addressing the layered trauma that led them into exploitation. This research really underscores why trauma-informed approaches are essential in demand reduction work. This next finding speaks to how early experiences shape what researchers call sexual scripts. Basically, the internal stories we develop about what sex means, what it's for, and how we're supposed to behave in sexual situations. When those scripts get distorted early in life, for example, when a child is sexualized too young or exposed to adult sexual behavior before they're developmentally ready, it can fundamentally alter their trajectory. So, what I have learned is whenever we have one of our sex buyer education programs in Columbus, we typically ask the question, as a show of hands, who has viewed porn in the last month? And typically, almost everybody's hand goes up. Then we ask them who has viewed porn in the last week. Still, almost everybody's hand goes up. And then when we ask the question, how many of you was your first exposure to sex pornography? Again, almost everybody's hand goes up. And that's the generation in the world that we are in today. For most young men, most young people in general, their first exposure to sex and what sex is came through porn. And porn does a very, very, very poor job of it representing what healthy sex is, what sex based on mutual respect and intimacy is. And I think as individuals are growing up with this early eroticization, they are taking those unhealthy views of what sex are with them. And from talking with men, again, this is subjective. I have no data based based on what I'm about to tell you. This is just conversations I've had with men when they are in healthy relationships and in relationships with women who have self-respect, they do not want to engage in the acts that these men grew up seeing in porn. And that leads to them looking for other opportunities to pursue those for some individuals, not for all men. So, normalized beliefs about the commercial sex trade, a combination of interrelated ideologies. We talk about locker room talk in our program a lot. What are you saying when you're alone with other men? When you're out on the golf course, when you're out having a drink, when you're watching a football game? How do you engage in conversations about women, and how is that reinforcing your beliefs around sex, power, relationships, human trafficking, sex buying, sex work, all of these things? And there's this ideology and these normalized beliefs that have developed with a lot of the men that come into our class. A lot of them walk in thinking that sex workers are in it because they're choosing to be in the industry. They don't realize that more often than not, there's a pimp or somebody behind them coercing them into the behavior. We always have a survivor come into our program and talk to the men about her experience being a sex buyer. And one of the things that she always says is she was a world-class actress. She it was very easy for her to convince the men that she was having sex with and um, selling herself to that they were the sexiest man alive and that she wanted to be doing this. They didn't realize that this was something that she had no choice in doing. We talk about how it's mostly a victimless crime. Buyers are merely taking care of their needs, and it's just guys being guys. I hear this in every single class. Men always say, well, it's the oldest profession. We're never going to get rid of it. And just because something has always been one way doesn't mean that it's right. And I think that we do a fairly good job in our class of getting men to see things from a little bit of a different perspective on that. So let's talk about the Columbus ACE study. We conducted a study in 2023 and 2024 for the men who have been through the Columbus Solicitor Education Program, where we had them take the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey. And I'd like to go over some of that data with you because it's helped us shape our curriculum in Columbus to be a little bit more impactful. And what we found was this study had a lot of interest countrywide. Having sex buyer intervention programs is not unique to Ohio. Most states have something similar. So we did have a lot of nationwide interest in what these results were. So our findings were 83% reported at least one adverse childhood experience, which is significantly higher than the national average. 44% had four or more ACEs, a level strongly associated with long-term behavioral, emotional, and relational harm. The average ACE score was 3.29 ACEs per individual. The national average is just over 1. ACE rates in this population are substantially higher than national averages. So why does this matter? Childhood trauma shapes adult coping behaviors, distorted beliefs, and risk-taking patterns, factors that directly influence sex buying behavior. Again, I mentioned earlier that we used to take a shaming approach to this. There are some municipalities and institutions out there that when an individual is arrested for purchasing sex in their community, their face is put on a billboard. That creates a spider web of harm that we try to not get into in Columbus. As you saw in the data earlier, most of the men who come to our class, they are married, they may have children, they may have spouses. Um, we try to be in the business of helping men understand why they engage in the behaviors they engage in and helping them change it without alienating their families and communities as well. And this ACE study has helped us shape how we do that. So let's talk about the the rates of adverse childhood experiences that we found in the individuals who took the survey. So of the 101 men who took the survey, 47.5% claim to have experienced emotional abuse. It's important to know that this is things that they've experienced before turning 18 years of age. Household substance abuse was 39.6%, incarcerated household member, 36.6%. Domestic violence, 35.6%. Loss of a parent, 34.7%. And that isn't just death of a parent, that also can be attributed to separation or divorce. Physical abuse is 34.7%, and sexual abuse is 22.8%. And I was very shocked initially when I saw that sexual abuse was so low. Now, it's still almost a quarter of the individuals, which is pretty high statistically. But as I have learned more about um, men admitting to childhood sexual abuse, depending on which study you read, the average length of time that has passed from the time a man was sexually abused in their childhood to admitting it openly is anywhere from 20 to 28 years. I'm personally a survivor of childhood sexual assault from when I was 9 and 13 years old. I didn't say it out loud for the first time until I was 31 years old. And no matter how many surveys I would have been given between that time from when I was 13 to 31, I would have never admitted to this. I have a suspicion, again, this is subjective, that if I could hop in the heads of a lot of the men who have taken the survey, chances are that may be a little bit higher. But right now, we know that about a quarter of the men, just a little bit less, have admitted to experiencing childhood sexual abuse. These adversities rarely occur alone. They're clustered, compounding emotional and behavioral impacts that last into adulthood. So, what the data may suggest. Sex buying behavior may be rooted in unresolved trauma, not simply impulsivity or a moral failure. Traumatic childhood environments commonly shape beliefs about sex, power, masculinity, intimacy, and self-worth. And high ACE levels indicate the need for trauma-informed diversion and cognitive behavioral intervention. So what this has helped us do in Columbus for both program and policy recommendations locally and statewide is to integrate trauma responsive curricula that address distorted thinking, coping skills, and criminogenic needs, which we'll get into that a little bit more later. But we have completely evolved our curriculum and our approach to sex buyer intervention in Columbus based on this information. Strengthen partnerships with mental health, addiction and recovery, and survivor advocacy providers. One of the things that we do, because we only get these men for one day, is I think that we are a catalyst. If we can help these men by putting them in a vulnerable environment where they feel comfortable being vulnerable, and we can start the process of change, we can then give them the resources that they need that are most helpful for them. For that man who was in his 70s and felt lonely, we can give him access to the resources he needs that are very specific for him. Whereas for another individual who may struggle with pornography addiction, we have a whole list of community resources that we can put in their hands and make available to them as well. And build systems that blend accountability with rehabilitation. We used to just be in the business of accountability. Now we want to make men better men. So giving them those resources for rehabilitation down the road, we think is going to have a much stronger and longer impact in our community as well. And really, we need to learn more. While we have growing research on what leads to individuals purchasing sex, most of this research specifically mentions transactions with female sex workers or does not specify the gender of the sex worker. We need a lot more research on this. People say to us all the time, why is it you're just having men in your class? Women are buying sex too. Why don't you have more individuals in the LGBTQIA plus community who are engaging with what your education is? And the reason for that is pretty simple. We are completely reliant on who police departments arrest. All of the current models used for sting operations for men who are buying sex or individuals who are buying sex are really targeted towards men. Basically, what happens is they put out an ad online saying to come to this hotel, and it's always a woman putting herself out there for sex from men. Right now, they're not really doing any other targets but for men right now. So right now, that's all the data we have. But until we start seeing divisions of police really start focusing on arresting um, a broader spectrum of society, we're not going to see this data change very much.
Great. And Stu started to go into it a little bit, but we're going to dive further into how we use all of this data and research now and what we actually do as part of our strategy for solicitor education. So if you want to move to the next slide, Stu. All of these demand reduction tactics have pros and cons. And when we look at this, we believe the best strategy is one that seeks to address the root issues that drive people to solicit sex. Our goal is to reduce the demand for sex trafficking by transforming solicitors, strugglers, and sideliners into champions for freedom from sexual slavery. So during each class, we provide a comprehensive list of local resources, as Stu mentioned, for solicitors to take the next step of getting help. So that list, as he alluded to, it includes licensed counselors, support groups, church ministries. Some counselors specialize in sex addiction, while others focus more on the mental, emotional, behavioral, relational, and even spiritual issues sometimes. Go ahead and move into the next slide. Actually, Stu, if you could go back one. Thank you. Our strategy starts in the solicitor education program, which is designed specifically for individuals who have already been arrested for buying sex. So what makes this program different from a typical diversion class is that it's built on the same evidence-based principles used in correctional rehabilitation. So instead of only providing information about laws or consequences, as other John's school models do, we target the criminogenic needs that the research tells us are most predictive of reoffending. That means we go deeper than simply saying, don't buy sex again. We address distorted belief systems. We talk about impulsivity, emotional regulation, empathy deficits, trauma histories, and the scripts buyers rely on to justify their behavior. Every component of the curriculum, every activity, every reflection exercise maps back to a specific cognitive behavioral target. So why does this approach matter? Because the research is clear. When programs directly address criminogenic needs, reoffending goes down. When they don't, people tend to fall back into the same thinking patterns that got them there. So our program works to interrupt those programs and those patterns. We help participants understand the ripple effects of their choices, confront the myths that they've internalized, unpack the role of childhood trauma that Stu talked about, and build healthier coping skills and relationship behaviors. The goal isn't just compliance, it's transformation. We want to equip them with internal tools that make future exploitation less likely, not just less convenient. And we can go ahead and move on to the next slide. The second piece of our strategy focuses on prevention, so stopping demand before it forms or escalates. And that's where the Columbus Demand Reduction Team comes in. This is our proactive community-based effort to reach men and boys upstream before they ever enter into the criminal justice system. Instead of waiting until someone has been arrested, we go into the community and talk openly about exploitation, healthy masculinity, boundary setting, porn-driven sexual scripts, and real consequences of buying sex. We treat demand reduction as a public health issue and not just a law enforcement issue. This means that education happens in schools, community centers, workplaces, and men's groups. Anywhere where young men and boys are forming their ideas about sexuality, masculinity, consent, and relationships. The goal is prevention at the cultural level. Because if we can shift beliefs early before the myths of, this is a victimless crime or just meeting a need take hold, we can reduce the number of men who ever even consider buying sex. We want to create a city where the demand is socially unacceptable, where empathy is the norm, and where young men understand that their choices have real impact on real people. Together, these two pieces, the intervention program for those who offend and the upstream education for those who haven't, form a comprehensive two-pronged approach. We're addressing both the immediate harm and the long-term cultural factors that fuel the market, the supply and demand that we talked about earlier. We can move to the next slide. So it's easy to become overwhelmed by kind of the sheer magnitude of what it takes to reduce the demand for trafficking, but change is possible. If we look at just some of this final John School data on the next couple slides, it shows that some people who graduated from this specific program have already started to change their minds about this issue, which is really the first step in the process. So if you look at this slide, would you change your mind about paying for sex if you knew that the majority of sex workers were homeless? 78% said yes, they would change their mind. So change is possible. Moving to the next one. Then was asked, would you change your mind if you knew majority of sex workers were victims of violence? Again, 81% yes, change is possible. And then the next one. Would you change your mind if you knew that the majority of sex workers start at a very young age? And again, 81% for that one. These are all very hopeful, reflective, and changing answers that can help us kind of fuel the hope that the demand reduction can work. Next slide. I do want to leave you with a story that proves a little bit more that change is possible. So there was a young man named Ryan who attended one of our private programs, and he said he struggled with depression and loneliness for years. So he decided to solicit and got arrested by an undercover officer. Now, since his arrest, Ryan graduated from our education program and became involved in our volunteer work, and even started teaching with the program before he relocated. Now, this quote is from him. So I think it's important to take a look at it that he states, over the past few years, I've been battling loneliness and depression. These struggles led me to make the worst decision of my life. A few months ago, I found myself at rock bottom and made the decision to solicit. Thankfully, I was arrested and stopped short of making a horrible mistake. Since this was my first offense and what will be my last, I was allowed to participate in the John School. I knew going into the program that I wanted to get involved in the fight against human trafficking, but after participating in the program, I knew I had to. The program opened my eyes to the world of human trafficking, and in my heart, I knew I wanted to help in any way possible. Through my experience, I found a relationship with God and gained a better understanding of the awful world of human trafficking that prior to this experience, I knew nothing about. I wish more than anything I could take back my mistake, but in a strange way, it's made me a better person. I now know I can move forward and raise awareness with dreams of ending this horrible issue. So Ryan's story isn't alone. We have two other graduates who have since become anti-trafficking advocates, and you can see their testimonies in the next couple slides here. Lewis, and you can take time to read that. I don't necessarily need to read them to you, but again, just testimonials as we see these statements of hope kind of coming out after the education programs. And Christopher. So at the end of the day, that's what this fight is all about. Seeing some of these, this education working and changing. So I'll hand it back over to Stu.
Thank you all very much for joining us today. I hope we gave you a little bit of insight into who is creating the demand for buying sex. I saw one question that popped up today, and I'd like to address that. The comment was, let me pull it up here. I want to make sure I just say this correctly. How did the Johns get more respect than the survivor? And this is a question that we get often. I'm not offended by this question by any means. I can only give an answer from my own perspective and what I'm exposed to here in Columbus, Ohio. For many, many years, Columbus has had what we call catch court, which is a court diversion program for women who have been arrested for um, for sex work. And what comes with that is a lot of resources, educational opportunities, housing opportunities, and Columbus does a really great job. We have so many survivor care organizations within Central Ohio, and I think we do a really great job compared to some other communities that I've worked with. And I would say that it's absolutely not perfect. I think that we could always do a much better job of giving general respect for all people. I think there are some individuals within our court system who don't handle this the right way. I think there are some individuals within our court system who go above and beyond and do such great work with this. Um, I wouldn't say that I believe the sex buyers are getting more respect, but I will say that my job is to do everything that I can to provide intervention that is hopefully long lasting and impactful. And that's what I try to do. And I just hope that I have counterparts that work on the survivor care space that are giving the individuals that they work with the same amount of care and respect that I'm trying to do on my end as well.
Thank you so much, Stu, for addressing that question. And thank you, Stu and Jen, both for being with us today. That was outstanding. You know me, I love data, so I'm thrilled with the data that you have. It really does give us a way to look at this and a way to analyze, going forward with this. And I truly appreciate the prevention piece that you've got in here as well. So thank you so much. And thank you for everybody for attending. I'll turn it over to Rachel for any last minute comments.
Yes, thank you. That was great information, and I appreciate your time today. I just wanted to tell you too that following in this series, we have a couple of more webinars set up for the first part of this year. We made a flyer, and I will attach that with the follow-up emails that comes out tomorrow. It was actually on the first part of the slides that got skipped this morning, but I just wanted to read off. So just a reminder, in February, we will have Stu who will be back again. And we're going to be having from insight to impact, how we reduce demand together. And Jen, are you going to be with him on that one as well? I think she might be joining him too on speaking on that. And that is on Tuesday, February the 17th at 2 o'clock. Then in April, we have the mail call advocating for survivors, the recognition and treatment of male survivors with Brian Bethel. And that will be Wednesday. So that's on a Wednesday. And we did that purposefully because sometimes people tell us your webinars are always on Tuesdays and I have court every Tuesday or I have a meeting. So we tried to mix it up just a little bit. So that one's going to be Wednesday, April 15th at 2 o'clock to 3:30. So that one's going to actually be an hour and a half. And in May, we have Engaging Men and Boys to Promote Nonviolence with Brandon Thompson and Glenn Harris. And that will be Tuesday, May 19th from 2 to 3. We also have some additional great speakers and webinars lined up for the next half of the year, but we thought we would just put that out now with all the registration links. So that will be coming in your follow-up email, and you can go ahead and register for those if you'd like. Thank you so much for attending today, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you.